Hello and welcome back to On the Workbench. Today we're taking a look at my 2006 Saab 9.3. This is the Sport Combi, or maybe you might call it the wagon version. And in a previous video, which I'll put a card to up above, I replaced the front suspension up here. But looking at the car, it's very apparent if you look back there that the rear end should be sitting up a little bit higher. There's been a few little creaks under the rear seat that you can hear coming from that part of the car, and it's clear that the rear suspension needs to get replaced as well, because I want to have a balanced car and one that doesn't have a rear end that is a little droopy, and so I can have a better ride quality. And so today we're going to be replacing the rear suspension as well as the springs. There's two parts to the suspension, the rear suspension on this vehicle. There are springs and there are shocks. So we're going to be replacing all those today. The parts for this job were ordered from esaabparts.com, not a sponsor. And when I was looking up all the parts and the information on this, it was interesting when I priced this out. If I bought the parts separately, it would have cost me about $60 or $70 more than if I bought a so-called kit. And so I had to provide my VIN number, and then they were able to provide me with the correct springs and shocks. And so basically all that kit is it's a pair of springs, the shocks, and then the upper shock mounts, and the upper shock mount bolts, and then the shock mount and the shock comes pre-bolted together, so then you don't have to mess with the oblong nut that sits on top up there, which is not a hex shape, incidentally. And so that was actually cheaper than me making that very simple assembly myself. And so I was willing to forego that to save a couple bucks. And the kit also included the lower spring mounts and then the upper spring mounts. I was a little intrigued with the upper spring mounts, the lower spring mounts that they sent. They seemed a little bit worn, at least at first glance. Maybe that's just from the packaging, but otherwise they feel new. So it's just maybe a cosmetic thing, and that's fine because no one's really going to see it. But one of the other pieces I had to add on to this order that was not part of the kit was the mounting screws and hardware. In my opinion, if I'm replacing suspension components, I'd like to replace the mounting hardware rather than reuse it, because the suspension undergoes a fair bit of stress over the years, and if the suspension components need to be replaced, it's really cheap to also add in the extra screws and bolts for a couple extra bucks. But those were not part of the kit. A couple important details about these parts is that, number one, there's a number of different spring options that you can get. There's the sport option, there's the standard option. It's important that you get the right set of springs for the car that you've got. If you dig around on the forums, you can find out the ways you can interpret the spring codes for your vehicle. I'm using the standard springs on mine, and then the shocks that go with this. The ones in the kit that I chose were Bilstein. These are made in Germany. And let's see if we can get that without the glare on camera there. I think that works. And you can see the part number 19140087. It's the same for the left and the right side, as well as the upper shock mount is the exact same for left versus right side. All these components can be switched between left and right, but you should replace them in pairs. You shouldn't be replacing only the left or only the right. You really should replace it in a pair and do both sides of the vehicle. And so that's it for the parts. Now we'll take a look at the tools. The tools that you're going to want for this repair, first of all, let's start with what's not on the screen here, and that's going to be a jack and jack stands. You're going to need both of those to be able to get the rear end off the ground, as well as some wheel chocks just to be able to safely get the vehicle up. Because you're going to definitely need the jack stands, because you need to come back with your jack to be able to raise up and lower the lower control arm and deal with the wheel knuckles relative to everything else. So you need the rear end to be on jack stands. So after you get through that, then the rest of the tools I think are relatively simple. So we've got a safety glasses and gloves. We're working on around power tools and in some dusty environments here. Just to make things easier, you want some penetrating oil, because these suspension bolts can be very tricky, and there's no reason to make it more difficult on yourself. Personally, I've become a fan of this stuff called freeze off. I think it actually works really well for breaking loose stubborn fasteners. In my opinion, there's no reason to risk damaging or stripping a bolt out more if you can just give it a quick squirt with some penetrating oil and be good to go. All right, then in terms of sockets, we're going to need a socket to be able to remove our wheels, and that's a 17 millimeter socket. I'm going to use a sleeved socket here so I don't damage my wheels. And then we're going to need two E-Torx sockets. These are like inverse or external Torx. We're going to need an E14 and an E20. Now I went with impact rated ones here because I'm going to pair those with my Proto 1/2-inch stubby impact gun. I would not attempt this completely with hand tools. I really think this is a job best done with either a pneumatic wrench or an electric powered tool. I know in 2020, pneumatic tools are going out of style, but I really like the power and the compactness that this Proto stubby really puts out. I think this little guy here is well outperforms and punches above its size and weight to be able to get this job done rather well. And the stubby size, because it's one of the bolts you're going to have to get at from behind. And so being stubby helps to deal with the reach that you need rather than being stuck too far back. And so then a couple other fasteners, you may want some extensions to deal with getting a torque wrench on there to being able to actually remove. And then you'll need a torque wrench to be able to put these bolts back together, get them properly torqued. There's also, you may want an 18 millimeter deep well and a breaker bar to remove one of the nuts. If you had a 6-point box end wrench, I think you could avoid doing this. I don't have an 18 millimeter 6-point box end wrench, so I'm just going to use a deep well socket and a breaker bar as a substitute. You also may want an alignment tool, just a quick punch, and you may want a little hammer if you need to be able to persuade. There's at least one specific bolt that goes horizontal to you that may require some additional persuasion to get through. And then the final tool, if I can call it a tool, is a little bit of knowledge in terms of what these torques need to be. There is, in order to replace the spring, there's going to be one bolt that we're going to end up removing that sits right behind and below the brake caliper. That has a torque spec of 55 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees. So we have torque and angle. So we got torque to yield fastener there. And then on the struts themselves, the upper nut on the strut, which in this case came pre-assembled from esaabparts.com, needs to be set to 20 foot-pounds. And then the upper 3 bolts all around the upper shock mount should be set to 39 foot-pounds. And then the lower bolt, this is the one that you've got to come in from behind, needs to be tightened to 111 foot-pounds. And so with those torque specs and the tools and the parts all together, let's go over to the car and let's start knocking this job out. All right, so we're in the passenger rear wheel well, and you can see here's our coil spring here for the suspension. If you look down here, you can see here is the lower spring mount. And then maybe you can see buried inside of there is a part of that lower spring, because the spring has indeed cracked and broke, and that confirms the sound that I was hearing from the rear seat of the car, and is obviously the reason why we're doing this repair. So now let's take a little step back out of there now that we know why we're doing this. You can see up here we have our upper shock mount. It's held in by 1, 2, 3 E-Torx bolts, and then there's another bolt down below, down on the back side there. And so then the first step is going to be to remove this and remove the shock before we actually deal with the spring. But before we do that, we're going to put our jack in place to help support this rear end, this side of the rear axle, just to make sure there's no issue with everything being held up correctly. Now to get started, I've got my jack holding up the rear end of the axle so that whenever I remove the shock assembly, this isn't going to come crashing down and damage my brake lines or anything else back here. And so to get started, I'm going to use a can of penetrating fluid. I'm going to use My personal favorite, this freeze off stuff, and give everything a quick little spray and let it sit for a couple moments, and then I'm going to proceed to remove the lower bolt first, followed by the upper bolt. The lower bolt is going to get removed using an external E-Torx number 20 socket. I'm going to just stick that in on the end of my impact gun. Bolt number 1. And now to remove the top, we're going to use our E14 socket. And you can see we've got this out, and you saw there's quite a bit of corrosion on these bolts. Again, that's why I'm not reusing them, and I'm just using new hardware on the assembly. So if I was only replacing the shock, all I'd have to do is just bolt in my new one and call it a day. In all honesty, this shock might still be good. There's definitely some rust on the bottom of it. This is an original OEM SOX, S-A-C-S, Saab shock. You can see that on the sticker there. Definitely some rust on it and corrosion on the upper shock mount. We're gonna go ahead and switch that out with the new one, but we're also doing springs, so we've got to deal with the springs. So getting to the spring assembly here can be a little tricky. We need to lower this axle, but not so much that we're going to create problems by lowering it too far. So we're going to use our jack and do a controlled lowering so we can maximize that spring. And now, depending upon how bad yours is in here, now notice right back over here is a brake line. That is very, very important as we think about how we're going to get this spring out. Now, to remove the spring, what I've got here is the spare tire screw jack jammed between that lower control arm and the upper side up there to go push down the lower control arm to help create the spacing for me to get the spring out. It's going to be important that you get that put in there just tight enough to make sure that you get that in there securely so you can loosen up the spring so we can actually remove the spring. All right, now to show you how to get the spring out, I switched sides to the other side of the car that has a full complete spring rather than the broken one you saw on the other side. And so to get this out, you can either use a spring compressor, and the official factory service recommendation is to use, basically it's a one-sided spring compressor that has the little C's that go around it and then compress an entire ring at a time, and you spin it up with an impact wrench and then pop it out. If you don't have that tool, we're going to go slightly different, and we're going to use a 18mm socket combined with an E20 socket. And we're going to go right down here on the lower control arm, and we're going to zip out that nut, and then we'll be able to separate that lower control arm from the rest of the brake assembly. Now it's going to be very important that we pay somewhat attention to this, that this doesn't separate too far. We've got a brake line back here that we have to make sure that we also protect. And so in this case here, I'm just going to use an 18mm impact socket on a breaker bar instead of a wrench, just to make sure I've got a good solid connection rather than putting a 12-point wrench on it. If you've got a 6-point box end, this would be the perfect time to break it out. But I don't have a 6-point box end. I'm just going to use a socket and a breaker bar to go opposite of my impact gun. I also have the jack underneath it here, just to make sure that this is fully supported as I go to remove this. All right, here you can see the breaker bar on the one side, impact gun on the other. There you go. There is the spring that is out. And there you go. There's the spring that's out. Now we got to remove the upper mount. Comes out just like that. Now it's time to go get our assembly. To put this together, I'm going to take the upper mount, which actually came in this GM bag. You see the part number there on the screen, hopefully. And then I'm just going to go ahead and take this. Then I'm just going to go ahead and take this and mount this up at the top. And I'm going to try to push it as far up as I can. Obviously the spring will carry it the rest of the way up. Our spring can go either way. Now with the spring, we've got our lower bump stop, and you see that this is actually hard for about the top inch or it's solid for about the top inch or so, and this provides a nice soft cushion at the bottom. And so this little notch right around here will actually lock into the coil here. It's going to be kind of a tight fit getting this through the bottom. And so we've got some different schools of thought, whether you go ahead and put this into the spring first, you put it on the lower mount, and then put the spring in between. I think it's easier just to go ahead and put this on the spring itself to start with, and then you just kind of work this in, and then it'll kind of seat itself automatically. So we'll just pick whichever end we want to be at the bottom of our spring. It doesn't really matter, the springs go both ways. And then we'll push it in. And then you see how now it is fully set here at the bottom. Then I'm going to start by putting the bottom of the spring in first, and then trying to get the and then get the top pushed in and around. There's a pin. Put the camera up. I'm going to start by putting it in the bottom, coming in the back side of the brake line, and then try to get it into the top here, then work its way around, and then we will be home free on the spring. And then now, after you've got the spring pushed in, hopefully you saw that in the camera, it didn't cut out there. I'm going to use the jack and put the arm of the jack underneath about where the lower bump stop is for the springs. I'm going to jack that up to try to get this hole correct here. Then I'm going to go ahead and put my bolt through. This may take a little bit of lining up to get this correctly lined. In my opinion, this might be the second trickiest part. The trickiest part is getting the spring actually in. The second part is getting this bolt back in. And then we finish up with the easy parts of getting the shock put in, because that's just pretty straightforward. Nothing shocking there. Ha, ha, ha. I promise I will stop with the bad humor. Now after getting that bolt all the way through the bottom here, the correct torque spec is going to be 55 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees. So you're going to want to get out your torque wrench to go make sure you get that torque down properly to 55 plus 90. All right, there we go. We got that all tightened up. Now all we gotta do is put in our shock. Now the last step is gonna be to mount the shock. And so like I mentioned earlier with the kit, this already has the upper shock mount on it. And so I'm gonna start by putting the first bolt through the actual closed eyelet. And I'm gonna start at the top just because that's gonna be easier to work with. And then at the bottom, I'm gonna have the hole at the bottom. I'm gonna just go ahead and turn the shock 90 degrees. And so now I'm going to turn the hole at the bottom to make sure it's facing the same direction. Then we're going to put the shock in, and then we're going to go ahead and hang it at the top. And then I'll drop in my other 3 bolts. I'm just going to take my E14 socket and just stick it on the end of an extension right quick here and just hand tighten these down a little bit just to get this held in temporarily. And then the 2 that are closed, I'm going to wait to put those in until I get my lower bolt in. That's going to go down on the back side over there. And so to get this one in, I may have to use the jack to raise or lower my assembly to get it to match up with the hole. So now I'm going to touch that just lightly with the impact on the back just to be able to get that the rest of the way in. And now that we got that in, we're going to go back and work on the top up here. And then our final step is going to be able to torque these upper bolts here to 39 foot-pounds. I'm going to double check again with one fewer extension. All right, that's good. And then the final step is going to be tighten our lower shock mount to 111 foot-pounds. The fact that this goes to 111 is why I had no problem putting an impact on that to begin with, because I knew the odds of me over-tightening that with my impact with just a light touch would be very minimal. And I'll just go ahead and drop that down off the jack. Now I should be able to fit my torque wrench back here. And now, that's good. While you're doing this job and you're in the wheel well, it's also a good time to check out your brake lines, check your parking brake cable, check your brake pad thickness, check your rotors and everything else back here to make sure it's looking good. Also, don't forget to check your tire pressure. And now, after getting all those properly torqued, the next thing is to put our wheel back on and then properly torque the lug nuts. And then we'll call it a day. All right, so then once you get the car back on the ground, go ahead and torque your lug nuts back down to 80 foot-pounds, and then you're done. Hopefully you can see a before and an after that the rear end and the gap between the rear tire and the fender well has increased and the car sits like it's supposed to be on the road. Obviously you want to then take it for a test drive and road test it and make sure everything looks good. It should sound better, especially in my case, since I had 2 broken rear springs, clearly not good and clearly a sign that it needed to be replaced, as well as I had bad bump stops. It was obviously time to get all that replaced. And so with that, I hope you found this video useful and interesting. I'll put some part numbers down below in the description. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, click the subscribe button. If you haven't already done so, I've got a whole playlist of other Saab 9.3 repairs that you might find interesting. Go ahead and check out that playlist. This video should be part of that playlist. And have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.